presentation on trauma and recovery in a time of COVID with Dr. Ashley Thiering. I'm Jane Myers, the Director of Faith Formation for Bellarmine Chapel. We're happy to be co-sponsoring this live stream with Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. This topic is especially fitting tonight since May is Mental Health Awareness Month. If you're watching this live, please know that there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions at any time in the chat box to the right of the live stream, or by using the web form linked on the same page you visited to access this live stream. Just click the blue button that reads Submit a Question. We also want to offer thanks to Father Eric Sundrup, who is running tech support for us again tonight. Thank you, Eric. Dr. Ashley Thiering is an assistant professor in theology, and she specializes in constructive and practical theologies. She completed her doctorate at the Boston University School of Theology, and her theological research is informed by her past work at a rape, crisis, and abuse center, Women Helping Women of Hamilton County. There she was both an advocate and educator. Her research continues to be informed by contemporary communities of trauma survivors and focuses on exploring religious practices, meaning making, and survival in response to trauma. Ashley also serves as the board president for Art, Religion, and Culture, a creative collaborative for theopoetics, and she's currently working on her forthcoming book, Fragile Resurrection: Hope After Domestic Violence. So let's welcome Ashley. Thanks for being here tonight with us, Ashley.
And thank you, Eric. Thanks, Bellarmine, for hosting this, and the ISSJ for having this talk tonight. And welcome to all of you tuning in live or those watching later. I hope this evening, for this evening to be an exploration of how what we know about the areas of trauma and recovery can help us understand the current pandemic crisis and give us ways to survive and thrive in this moment. So second slide. Thanks, Eric. So this is kind of the question that I think really is going to be most helpful for us tonight. So the question that I think it really frames the conversation is, what does hope look like during and after COVID-19? So those of you who are tuning in, hearing, trauma and recovery, we are going to move towards hope, which is, I think, a really good place to finish in this time. So next slide. So Dr. Shelley Rambo, in her book Spirit and Trauma, defines trauma as it's a description of an encounter with death. This encounter is not, however, a literal death, but a way of describing a radical event or events that shatter all that one knows about the world and all the familiar ways of operating within it. A basic disconnection occurs from what we know, from what one knows to be true and safe in the world. The DSM-5 defines trauma as direct or indirect or over time, and usually focuses around an event. And this event can be death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And then Judith Herman, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, which is a very kind of watershed book for the trauma and recovery field, defines trauma or the traumatic event as something extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. So we're not talking about something that happens, again, rarely, but rather something that is not, quote unquote, normal to how we function in daily life and in our world, and therefore disrupts how we understand ourselves in that world. And our worldviews have to shift. And that shift often causes a lot of these traumatic symptoms that we're going to be talking about tonight, and some of the ways that we ourselves are experiencing this shift in our current world. The next slide. Thank you. So we're talking about a continuum here. And I don't want to say, and I don't want you to walk away with thinking that because we're going through this current situation that we're all traumatized, right? This is a continuum, and what's stressful for one person may induce a crisis response in another. So along this continuum, there's stressors, things that can be acute events of one's life experience, such as an injury, or something that's chronic, an ongoing cumulative effect, such as drug and alcohol abuse, homelessness, something that kind of continues on for a longer period of time. And then in the center here, we've got trauma, which is, again, focuses on this injury to the worldview. So there's some aspect of our kind of functioning in daily life that no longer is helpful and no longer works for this kind of post-traumatic event world. So it's a perception, and it's when an individual realizes that they've undergone some sort of physical or psychological injury, and this, again, reshapes their worldview. And then the final piece, crisis, is kind of the moment of trauma in which the danger that is being perceived results in shock or shutting down or other pathological self-defense mechanisms like alcohol or drug abuse. So again, I kind of want us to think about this evening, not necessarily saying that we're all in this moment of trauma or in crisis, but we're all dealing with new events and new stressors, and where we find ourselves along this continuum may shift depending on which events or stressors we're experiencing during this time of pandemic. All right, the next slide, Eric. So we're going to look at a little bit of some of these symptoms. Trauma can result in several types of symptoms, as outlined by Judith Herman in her book, Trauma and Recovery. So we have got these set of symptoms called hyperarousal, which is an elevated baseline of arousal. Essentially, the body is on high alert. This includes things like being sensitive to noise or being easily disturbed in sleep. Then there are symptoms that go under this category of intrusion, which is reliving the event as if it's in the present moment. So these are things like flashback or fixation, traumatic dreams, risk-taking behaviors, which are often tied to a reenactment of the actual traumatic event itself. And so the person is no longer kind of moving forward in time, but rather fixated or stuck in this one event. And then the third category, constriction, is about the shutting down of these self-defense mechanisms. So things like numbness or detachment or alcohol and drug use. All of these things kind of deal with a shutting down or a shutting off of the person from the outside world. And again, this comes from a self-defense mechanism, but is no longer functioning properly when someone is especially under the situations of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is kind of our discussion around, or at least a little bit of information around trauma as a lens. And another piece of trauma, or this trauma theory that I want us to look at, is moral injury. So on the next slide, we have moral injury is a term that mostly is within the military context, used mostly within the originally within the military context. It is being now applied to broad areas, including the pre-sexual abuse crisis or the current situations that frontline workers in COVID-19 are facing. But the definition originally, one of the definitions by Litz here, the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So the key here is that there are kind of three parts to this moral injury or a morally injurious event. There is the betrayal of what's right. So there is a moral wrong happening. It's usually by a person in authority or by the self. And so there's some kind of expansion here that it could be a commanding officer or a priest or a teacher, a mentor, someone who is supposed to have authority over the person. Or it could be a act that is done by the self. And classic examples in this conversation of moral injury, again, began in the realm of military violence. So things like killing in combat or giving orders to do such, or orders which seemed immoral at the time, or witnessing acts of violence of a commanding officer, etc. So the importance of this kind of label, moral injury, is not that it gives us necessarily brand new insight, because intuitively we know when military vets come home, they are dealing with some sort of trauma, right? There is, PTSD is one of the major pieces that military veterans are coming home with. But moral injury helps us to define this even more specifically and give language to talk about this specific event that's happening and kind of the phenomenon that we're seeing here. And some of the major differences between just PTSD and what we know as moral injury are things like PTSD deals with that threat of death, whereas moral injury is dealing with a violation of morals. And so it doesn't necessarily have to do with feeling physically scared for your life, but rather that something morally wrong has happened. PTSD also focuses mostly on the victims and witnesses, whereas moral injury includes the perpetrator. And so it could be the person who perpetrated the event or killed in combat or whatever the situation might be. Next, the PTSD deals again with this fear response, and moral injury deals with shame. And so the sense that I could have done something different or I should have done something different. And then finally, what has been violated and therefore must be restored in both of these is different. So for PTSD survivors, safety is the key reestablishing aspect. So kind of reestablishing safety, getting control of one's life, all those pieces. Whereas in moral injury, what's been violated is a level of trust in the self, in authority, and in the world. And so that trust must be restored. So when we think about this term moral injury, I think it's really helpful for what we're seeing today in a lot of our frontline workers. So on the next slide, we can see here that the kind of key characteristics of moral injury we can really see applying to frontline workers in the COVID-19. So when I say frontline workers, I'm talking about those working in the hospitals, those working at grocery stores, those, all essentially the essential employees that are continuing to have to work. And especially for those working with the sick or with the elderly. So this first point here, moral injury is kind of ramped up or essentially more likely if there's a loss of life to vulnerable persons, so children, women, the elderly. And what we know about COVID-19 is that it does affect those who have been immunocompromised more. And so doctors and nurses and those working in hospitals and on that kind of frontline area, they're seeing this firsthand, that these people are vulnerable persons. And what we know about what's happening in care homes for the elderly, this is also a big piece of that. And second, leaders are perceived to not take responsibility for the event and are unsupportive of staff. And from what we know, in general, the staff and frontline workers are dealing with a lack of not necessarily support, but definitely a lack of response, right? They don't have enough equipment. They're not getting the kind of moves that need to be made. They're often, the needs of the hospitals and the healthcare system to respond are being put below the needs of the economy. And so when they hear this, either on the news or in person, that can be really demoralizing and feeling like they're not being supported in the way they need to, even though they're facing such dire situations. Third here, the staff feel unaware, unprepared emotionally, psychologically for what is happening. And I think this is, so true to COVID-19 because we really did not necessarily, quote unquote, see this coming. You think back to late February and it was a completely different world. And I'm sure healthcare workers, while knowing, even if they were aware of what was happening in China, by January, we were more aware of this. Still, that is kind of a switch that had to be turned on. And there wasn't really a lot of preparation to deal with the amount of death and illness that they were going to be facing, especially in areas of crisis like New York or Wuhan. Number 4 here occurs concurrently with exposure to other traumatic events, death of a loved one, etc. And this is probably very true for a lot of frontline workers who are dealing with either the sickness of their own families or the fear of their own families becoming sick. And so the kind of general stressor that COVID-19 for a lot of us non-frontline workers are facing, this kind of becomes an extra event or an extra stressor on top of what's already occurring for them. And then finally, there is a lack of social support following the PMIE here is the event or the potentially morally injurious event. So what it's talking about here is, and this is really where we're at, as we begin to respond and support our frontline workers. What does that look like? How do we actually provide support and forms a space for them to recover and space for them to process and be witnessed to? So what does that look like? And I think knowing a little bit about what is needed for the healing of moral injury is going to help us kind of give our marching orders of how do we support our frontline workers the best. And what we know is that frontline workers, or those working, physicians, nurses working in the hospitals, are already facing increased mental health issues. And so, for example, in China, who's slightly ahead of us in the COVID-19 experience, the Chinese physicians there have reported 50% of the physicians there are experiencing depression, 44% are experiencing anxiety, 34% report having insomnia. So already we can see that there is a toll on our physicians and workers in the hospitals and in those healthcare settings. And many have warned that after COVID-19 is under control, or we have a vaccine, or however we kind of finish this time in our lives, we'll be dealing with an epidemic of healthcare crisis. So our essential workers are going to need our support, and it's not going to be something that just goes away. So it's really important, especially for areas where they're being hit the hardest, like New York or Wuhan. The after effects of this are going to be felt for years, if not decades, and we need to be kind of prepared to support them in the most that we can. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the theological questions and insights that these two, trauma and moral injury kind of make me think of in this moment, and some of the things that I wanted to highlight for you all who aren't familiar necessarily with trauma theology. So the first piece here is, often when we come to a crisis situation or a moment of suffering or trauma, the question around the nature of God is a big one. So this is known in theology as the theodicy question. If God is good, why is there evil? And so that is a big question that we have. How can we think about God in this moment in a way that makes sense to our moment and to our suffering, in a way that acknowledges the feeling of absence of God, and then also names and finds God in moments where we can. So questions like, what is God's role in moments of suffering is a big one for us to kind of sit with and to think about. Do we understand God as a co-sufferer, someone who witnesses to our suffering and is with us in those moments? Or do we need a God who is unmoved, who is much stronger than that, who can be our support or our anchor? What is kind of most important for us in this moment? So I think these are things that I can't necessarily answer tonight, but rather questions I want us to sit with together and perhaps kind of keep coming back to throughout this time. The second piece here, the nature of sin and our communal responsibility. I think when we think about moral injury, this is really interesting and helpful. So how do we understand or define sin? With moral injury, there's a sense often that the sense of shame that I did something wrong, or I could have helped in this situation. So we think about our frontline workers who are facing situations they not necessarily were prepared for, they don't have the equipment, and how do we hold their sense of shame and guilt and acknowledge that there was something institutionally wrong or structurally wrong or systematic about this? So the systemic nature of sin, I think, is really important for us to acknowledge, in addition to personal or individual choices. And I think this is a way for us to help our frontline workers reimagine their own sense of shame or guilt, is to acknowledge that we are all in this together, not in a cliche way, but in the sense that we are part of this system that resulted in this failure, and we can be a part of the fixing of that as well. Jennifer Bestie uses the phrase mediation of grace. So she talks about how grace is socially mediated. And I think this is very helpful, because in the same way that sin is systematic and deals with a whole community, we can also think about grace being an aspect that is part of the community and is mediated through that community. So we need to be there for each other. We need to build those spaces of listening in ways that we can essentially represent God for each other. We can be the hands and feet of God, as Teresa Avila says. So it's important for us to understand that, we we must be present to each other in that way to allow for that grace to kind of move forward. And then in the same kind of the flip side of this, the human capacity to wound and be wounded is important to acknowledge that because we can mediate grace and be kind of sacramental embodiments of the divine for each other, of the divine presence, we are also responsible for each other and therefore can cause harm and suffering and trauma. And so it's important for us to be really aware of how we are being present for each other and in what ways have we failed each other. So acknowledging kind of that communal, again, communal responsibility. The narratives of the crucifixion, Holy Saturday, and resurrection are, I think, really important for us to be reflecting on. I think it was strangely helpful for a lot of the isolation and COVID lockdown to happen during Lent and Easter, because it was just this constant reminder of this narrative. And I want to highlight, again, Dr. Shelley Rambo talks about the importance of Holy Saturday. And I really think that we're still in that space, this sense of we can't move too quickly to the getting, quote unquote, getting back to normal or moving towards healing, because we're really in this space still that we haven't named what has happened, and we're not necessarily prepared to move to that next level. And so I think giving that space of Holy Saturday to give us that time to really think wisely of how do we move forward and how do we name what happened. And, again, pushing back against that rushing to, quote unquote, get back to normal, while acknowledging the need to support livelihoods and, the need for caring for families and all the things that have been essentially fallen through the cracks. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we switch to kind of the recovery aspects. And this last piece here is the role of ritual, imagination, and play. And I really can't stress this enough that a lot of what we're going to talk about when we think about healing and recovery is this sense of control and of routine. And I think ritual is something that can help us with that. What I think a lot of our current situation has shown us, though, is that some of our rituals need to be rethought through. For example, Sunday when I tune in to church and I'm sitting with, virtually with all of my fellow Catholics, and then the Eucharistic prayer comes up and I can't take the Eucharist. And it's like, how do we rethink this, or how do we reimagine this prayer, or what needs to happen in a way that helps to embody it in the same way that the Eucharist did. Baptisms, people aren't being baptized right now. Infants aren't being baptized. How do we think about this? The ritual, every time I wash my daughter's hands, I think of the ritual washing of hands from during the Easter season, and I think about this kind of ritualistic aspect of it, and I wonder if there are ways that we can re-embody these in our own homes. Again, with the imagination piece, I think a lot of what we're looking at right now is the ability to reimagine what we move into. And so we're going to come back to that in a moment. And then play. I think a lot of finding those moments of joy in this time where we can kind of reimagine and play and, mess around with what our roles might be in certain areas or spaces. Or if I'm working from home, how does that look differently if I work in this room versus this room? Or if I'm out of work, how can I kind of use this extra space or find different places where I can kind of flex those same muscles? And so I think play deals more with like allowing ourselves to make mistakes and to reimagine things. So on the next slide, we're going to start to move into that recovery piece. And so Judith Herman outlines kind of trauma recovery in these 3 stages. So establishing safety, remembrance and mourning, and then reconnection. And I think a lot of, the pieces that I'm giving you all here tonight aren't the end all be all of understanding trauma, right? These are, I think, really great umbrella terms to help us wrestle with some of the things and to give us kind of markers for having conversation starters. So with establishing safety, parts of that include things like naming the problem. So having education around the issue, being able to name and know what has happened, restoring control, establishing a safe environment, And then self-care routines. All of these have to do with kind of returning the locus of control to the person, to each individual, and to kind of create those spaces in our where we are. So in our homes, and with our kind of nuclear families in that respect, or if we're alone, with ourselves in that respect. Remembrance and mourning. So here we're thinking about kind of reconstructing and telling the story. I don't think we're quite here yet, but being able to narrate what happened is going to be really important, and how we narrate that communally, I think, is going to show how we move forward. Transforming these memories through testimony is a big piece of this remembrance and mourning, and then mourning loss. So when we talk about mourning loss, in kind of the trauma and moral injury, we're thinking about the loss of either a loved one, or the loss of some self-identity, or different aspects in that respect. And then reconnection has to do with reconciling with the self and with others, choosing to kind of move back into the world, and then finding that mission that allows us to kind of make sense of the trauma that happened. And when we think about PTSD or trauma versus moral injury, there are slight differences when we think about recovery. So studies find that PTSD treatments for survivors of moral injury only are moderately effective about half of the patients. So it's important for us to acknowledge that these are different categories and need to be responded to differently. And what moral injury highlights is the need for both a social and a personal recovery. So a kind of a ritualized cleansing and returning to society, memorialization where the public is aware and held accountable for all aspects that were involved, and then this importance of witness, of the person who's experiencing moral injury being able to narrate and be heard with their story. So on the next slide, here, I want to talk a little bit about theological hope. So in her book on hope, Flora Keshkagian writes, "There is no final victory over evil, no end to tragic suffering, but there is resistance and persistence and resilience. Hope is in the going on and finding, in and through living moments of joy and occasions of justice, sorry." So here, hope is often, people hear, theological hope, and they think of this kind of very optimistic, oh, I'm hoping this will happen, or, I have hope that things will be better. But hope is actually a much more robust understanding or term. And I like to think of it in these kind of three aspects that help to make it that more robust theological idea. So first, hope names evil and suffering. So it gives a name and points out what has happened, what is causing the suffering, and then explores the possibility of actions in the here and now, even in the midst of suffering. What type of actions can we take in a way that names the suffering? Second, it uses imagination to open the future while leaving room for possible return of trauma. And so this opening of the future is a huge piece of what Moltmann and Metz in theology are talking about, is rationally or realistically, we're not going to stay the same, right? The future is open. And so to have hope that future is going to change is realistic. It's reasonable. And so it's something that we should kind of look towards. And when we know that we're not going to stay the same, we can embrace that change and kind of help transform that future piece. And then third, that hope is mediated through healthy relationships and practices such as ritual or even mundane tasks of life. And this is something we often think of, practices of hope being so kind of out of the ordinary or extraordinary, but really these are, just being able to live into a routine or care for our loved ones can be kind of these compassionate acts of, because if you are caring for your family, you are essentially saying this family is worth taking care of into the future, right? I'm loving and feeding my daughter so that she can grow and change and live into that future. And so this is a kind of almost a radical practice of hope in the sense that I believe she will continue into the future. And so those healthy relationships are really important and key to that. So I want to really quickly here shift to our current situation. So on the next slide, I want to kind of bring it on home, right? So where are we now? What does this have to do with our current situation? So where are we in this process? When we think about establishing safety, naming and denouncing suffering, I think, is a big piece of this, right? Naming that this is not a normal time. People are dying. People are dying alone. People are suffering job loss. People are suffering from loneliness. We're isolated, right? These are things that we need to name. There are also things that we need to look for their root causes, right? This isolation. There's fear. There has been greed. There's hopelessness. And so then another way of establishing safety is when we name these things to start to move forward by creating routines. How can we create a routine in isolation, right? Tomorrow am I going to wake up, have breakfast, kind of create a space in which I can feel safe. I can feel that kind of day-to-day life as if things were quote unquote normal. Rituals for cleansing or returning. So these can be literal or figurative cleansing, right? That washing of hands, returning home, kind of making a safe space in our home and being able to leave everything else outside of that. And those type of ritual moments, I think, will help us all to establish safety in ways that we may not, they seem like normal, very simple things to do, but they can help us really create that safe space and return the locus of control to us, right? So we're not just being thrown about by the public or the rules that are happening outside of us. Remembrance and mourning. Again, we're not quite here yet, but I think we are starting to do this where we are mourning the loss of jobs, of routine, we're mourning loss of family members, of loved ones, and all of these things need to be named and allow space for mourning. It's not, even if you haven't experienced the loss of a family member or a loved one in this situation, you are experiencing the loss of your routine and perhaps of your job, or at least the way things used to be. And that is a loss, and it should be allowed to be mourned. Memorializations, we are going to begin to create a public narrative. And I think we should be really attentive to what that looks like and what type of language we use. And we need to make sure that it is speaking truth of what happened and it subverts the evil that happened. All right. One ways that we can do this is witnessing to each other. So listening to the different experiences, because a lot of us are having a variety of experiences of this moment, whether you're completely out of a job waiting for unemployment payments, or you're working on the front lines, working in a hospital. So how can we reach across and listen to each other and allow that to shape our narrative? And then finally, reconnection. And this, again, is most likely into the future, but we can do practices of this in the moment. Doing these types of live streams or tuning into a Sunday worship are ways for us to create community, providing spaces, especially once we move into a more interactive, in-person life again, creating spaces for frontline workers to come together to mourn and to talk and reconnect, for us to come together and be allowed to, with our families, remember how things were and how it was different. And then with reconnection, also imagining and embodying this practice of the future. And this is where I want to leave us for tonight. So on the last slide, where do we go from here? Right. So in Spirit and Trauma, Shelley Rambo's book, she writes about Holy Saturday, as I mentioned before. Holy Saturday thus brings the past to light, but it does so in a way that is not debilitating. It provides a way of being oriented to the past, holding it in such a way that it is recognized and yet in the holding transformed. What this means to me is that we are in a moment where we are kind of in this Holy Saturday moment. We're holding the space of, we are experiencing suffering. We are seeing it around us. We've had experience, and we're moving through this space. How do we want to move into the future? What does this new world look like? Because in what we know about trauma or about this type of event is there's no going back. It's, this push to go back to normal is not going to be healthy. It's not going to work. It's ultimately ignoring the truths and the important things that we've learned from this moment. So what do we want to keep from before? Physically being together, being embodied, having those embodied practices, quote unquote, feeling normal, shopping, movies, restaurants, daycare. But can we keep all of those? So what can we keep from before? So really looking at those things and saying, what do we need to do to our public spaces to transform them into safe spaces again, right? Is shopping going to look the way it did? Are restaurants going to look the way they did? Daycare, right? All these things. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to look at those and to really think what they look like. But I think we have this moment to do that. What do we want to reimagine? Things like our healthcare system, or how we use technology to connect and support each other. What do churches look like? What do schools look like? What do daycares look like? All of these things can have this we have this moment to really reimagine and to move into that, because we almost kind of set a pause on a lot of these things. Our healthcare system, there's less of a pause, right? We need to move into this moment very quickly. And then finally, what must we reimagine? Public spaces, schools, courts, shopping. How do our jobs look? How do we support working families? All these things need to kind of be reimagined as we move forward. And then, what has COVID-19 taught us? I think, reflecting on some of the benefits of what we've experienced, right? That we need each other, that we need more support, that our healthcare and financial systems are broken in some ways that we really need to address, and that everyone needs grace and space. Someone the other day during a department meeting had said, let's give each other the benefit of the doubt. These are unusual times. And I thought about that, and I thought, this isn't that different from when I was in that first 6 weeks of my daughter being born, right? We were isolated. We weren't allowed to go anywhere. I was sleepless. I was, all these things. And this feels a lot like that, right? This transformative moment for those who are living with disability, or for those living with autoimmune disease or cancer. This isn't that unusual of a time. And so I think perhaps we should be giving each other the benefit of the doubt more often. We need that grace and space. And hopefully that teaches us that we can reimagine society in a way that takes seriously the contingency of our lives. I want to leave you guys with Keshkagian's quote here again. Hope is in the going on and finding, in and through living, moments of joy and occasions of justice. So I hope that we can move forward and find these moments of joy, and definitely find these occasions for justice, and to work for that in the future. Right. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much. Take a breath, and maybe you want a sip of your water there too before I send these questions out to you here. We have several good questions that have come in. Here's one. I love the notion of grace as communally mediated and experienced in community. This is one reason that social distancing has become so hard, right? It takes us away from one way of experiencing God's grace. So, how might we recreate or rebuild community moving forward so that we can experience God's grace in new ways in community?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, so that idea of grace being mediated socially is an idea that comes out of a lot of liberation theologians, but especially I pull it from Jennifer Bestie's book, where she looks at kind of the importance of us mediating that presence of God. And we're still figuring those things out, of how to mediate those communities. I think the ways that we can use technology, I think, are very helpful. So things like, FaceTime, and making sure that we have, family dinners, and set up the computer when possible, and try to reach out as much as we can. I spent probably 6 days trying to get my grandfather to be able to use Zoom. We got it to work. She had finally someone who could hear, because he's deaf, came in and helped me set it up. And then he couldn't hear us, but he got to watch my daughter play for, like 30 minutes. And then he was like, all right, well, I'll see you guys next week. And so I know it's not the same as being embodied with each other. But I know of pastoral counselors who are doing Zoom sessions, who are hearing each other, hearing you and witnessing. And I think we're just going to continue to find those things and to use what we can. And hopefully that'll be something, when we are able to be closer physically to each other, is something we're going to try to kind of bring back online in a way that's safe, in a way that respects the health of a pastoral worker or of a community. So yeah, I think we're all trying to figure out how to, especially communities that are genuine, right? It's not just everyone sitting in a Zoom session staring at each other, but that are working towards things, working on projects together, or, reading books together, having book clubs, or reading to children, or, those different things.
It's not always possible. for people, for some people, and that something else other than just a reset must be named and be made to be an okay place to be.
Yes. So
Let me repeat that question for you. Okay, so this person's asking, what are your thoughts about the position that recovery as such is not always possible for people? That something else other than just a reset must be named and be made to be an okay place to be.
yes. So this is a great question because the term recovery is actually pretty, it's not as liked in trauma theory because it doesn't really name the truth, right? There is no going back. There's no recovery of what was before. There is a new normal. And as hard as that is, especially in moments where we really want to go back to what was normal, acknowledging the new normal or what life looks like post the traumatic event or post COVID-19 or post whatever we're talking about, we're always changing, right? We're always being shaped and changed by our life experiences and trauma, especially. And so I think, you know, that there's not like kind of a singular term to talk about this new normal. I think Shelley Rambo does a great job in her book on woundedness. A lot of theologians are wrestling with this idea of how do we name the resurrection, essentially, right? It's not, Jesus doesn't come, he's not resuscitated. He's not Jesus, the body alive again, but rather something new, something that we're still processing what that resurrected body looks like. So I think that's something that we definitely need to name. That recovery is a term that is imperfect. It's not actually a recovering of what was, but rather something new. Very good question.
Okay. Why is it important that our hope leave room for doubt, as you say, or for the potential return of trauma?
So this is actually tied to what we kind of just talked about. So the idea that hope in reimagining the future needs to acknowledge that there is going to be a kind of a cyclical. We live in a cycle of death and rebirth, right? This idea of we face crucifixions and resurrections multiple times, as Latino liberation theologians talk about. That we don't just hope into the future and then we're done, right? We're all healed and our rest of our life is great. But rather, we face these moments of suffering and we may kind of re-experience. And when we think about, especially for those who are healing from trauma, the reliving is a very big part, and it's something that is kind of in their brains. And so to acknowledge that you can still doubt and look towards the future. So this is an idea called reasonable hope. So the idea that you can understand that I can be hopeful of an open future, but also understand that there's going to be problems or hiccups or things that I'm going to need to overcome in that future as well.
Okay. Um, I have just two more questions for you. This one, the linking of resilience to trauma through finding, as you say, occasions of justice is a new perspective for me. Could you say more about how that would function, that finding occasions of justice would function either for an individual or for a community?
Yeah, so I think one of the greatest examples I have that comes to mind of this idea of healing or resilience or building up resilience through working towards justice is for survivors of like domestic violence or sexual assault. So when I worked with Women Helping Women, a lot of survivors kind of after their years of healing process and later on down the line, they would become volunteers or they would kind of come back to serve the community and other women who have gone through what they went through. And that is often, Judith Herman calls it kind of finding a mission. And I think that's a big piece for folks to make sense of what happened to them, to say, this happened to me, but I have turned it into something positive, or I have turned it into something that can move forward. And so that, I think, relates to that occasions of justice. So when we think about in our own situation, how do we respond to COVID-19 or to our current pandemic situation? I think thinking about, how do we move forward? How do we learn from this? How do we make sense of it? Where do we need to, fix our systems that have failed us? And that, I think, is that justice question, right? Who has fallen through the cracks? Who right now is trying to survive without a job? Who is not getting the health care that they need, or not going to the hospital because they don't have insurance, or all these big justice questions, right?
From one of our teens who has been participating here tonight, and this person's asking, what advice do you have for a teen who is interested in going into mental health?
Great. Well, I mean, for if you're thinking about doing mental health at pretty much any capacity, you definitely need to go into an undergrad degree, perhaps a master's degree. But I think the best thing, those are the obvious things to do. I think the best thing, though, to do alongside that is to volunteer with agencies that you find importance in, that you are passionate about. Because I wanted to teach theology, and I wanted to do a lot of these things, but I didn't find my passion until I started working with women, helping women. And I think that will really tell you where you want to work, right? So if you start to volunteer for prison ministries, or for hospital chaplaincy, or just in general healthcare, working at a mental health facility. And if you get there and realize this isn't a fit, or perhaps you might walk into something that's even better of a fit, I think those practical experiences are so helpful. And especially, as being a teen looking into the future, starting that now is a great opportunity, because you'll start to make those networks and those connections, and those experiences are going to inform and make your college experience, or those classes that you'll have to take, so much more worth it, because they'll make sense. Your experience will become a light for those texts to look at and to challenge, and it'll become so much more meaningful for you.
Okay. Okay. Beautiful. Thanks for that, for all those answers. So, and thanks so much, Dr. Thuring, for helping us explore trauma theology and recovery during this uh, really extraordinary time of COVID-19. You've given us a lot to reflect on and to practice. Thank you as well to those who have joined us this evening. This live stream will be available as a recording on the Bellarmine Chapel YouTube channel, so please feel free to share that with others. Uh, Two notes on upcoming events. First, in recognition again of Mental Health Month this May, parishioner Mary Duenas will be offering training in Capacitar practices for well-being and stress management on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m., also on Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. You can find those details on our parish website. And for the next time, we will be partnering again with the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice for another live stream talk. That one will be on Monday, June 1st at 7 o'clock with Dr. Adam Clark. His topic will be COVID-19, racial justice, and mass incarceration. So we hope to see you again soon. Thanks again to you, Ashley, and thanks everyone for joining us. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric.